Welcome back. Or if you're new, welcome to the show. If you're a returning guest to the show or returning listener to the show, you might be asking yourself, why are they doing a formal introduction? These are the two most informal people in podcasting. And if you're new to the show, you're like, wow, I would have thought it was just a normal podcast where that's what everyone does. We're turning over a new leaf here at RX Radio. So welcome to the newcomers. Welcome back to our subscribers and listeners. This is RX Radio. I am your co-host, Jordan Shallow, and with me, as always, Dr. Jordan Jiunta, in the flesh, kind of.
Yeah, welcome, friends. Thanks for being here.
Oh, that was hard.
It sounded like an effort.
It was
You did a good
forced.
job, but
Thank you.
it wasn't like someone was holding a gun to your head, but it sounded like someone told you to do that, and you're like,
You know
I'll
what?
do it, but I don't want to do it.
It felt kind of like a Guantanamo Bay-esque a little bit. It felt a little bit
Yeah,
forced.
hold up a
against my
newspaper
will.
with the current date on it, would you? I need to
I
know
believe
he's
it's
still
called
alive.
Advanced interrogation techniques, I believe, is what the U.S. military refers to that procedure as. Well, welcome to the show. For those of you who have joined us in the past, we have adopted somewhat of a new format. So those of you just joining us, we used to run 3 episodes a week with our co-host and compadres, James Thayer, James McIntosh. Now we have 3 separate channels. So Mac and Thayer are over at Paint the Edges podcast. So Spotify and Apple iTunes, head over to Paint the Edges. James McIntosh, James Thayer. They're up on Sunday. Strength in Context is our other show. Strength in Context, hosted by the one and only Big Papi de Hoyos the Third, Destrez, as the gringo would say, and Brandon Schultz. Over there on Friday, again, head on over to iTunes and Spotify to get Strength in Context with Jorge and Schultz. That episode goes up on Friday, and holding it down on the Wednesday spot, as we have for so many years.
So many.
Crazy. 2016?
Yeah.
Oh.
We're like 560, 570 episodes deep at this point.
We're deep, man. This is
That's
the
wild.
most committed I've ever been to anything in my entire life, which, take that with a grain of salt. So, new kind of format. What we're going to be focusing on now with a single episode a week is we're going to kind of do some deep dives. Jay and I's background in the clinical world, in the athletics world, in the strength coaching world. We usually bring a ton of experience and evidence to the topics that we discuss, kind of a different slant, especially as we kind of meld our way into the education world as well, as Jay and I are co-founders of Prescript. I want to start to play a little bit in the research game and see where research meets application. Because one of my favorite quotes is, in theory, there's no difference in practice and theory, but in practice there is. And so we're going to take topics, we're going to dissect them, we're going to examine some of the research. But I think more importantly is we're still going to take that overlay of experience and be like, look, in the real world, this is how this stuff actually works. So you don't end up, blowing sunshine up your asshole at 6:30 in the morning or whatever the best practices and research are right now. So today I thought we would start with what I think is a good topic for the general fitness community, but also strength coaches at the highest level, because I think it's something that's widely misunderstood, but it's a principle that you have to contend with at every single level. And that's detraining, right? What do you do when you take time away from the gym? Right. So that'll be kind of the question that we pose out of the gate, I guess, starting off with kind of a personal take. Now, knowing you and how little time you've ever spent away from the gym, this will be maybe more on the professional side and dealing with clients who've taken time off. How do you approach detraining with one of your clients or one of your athletes or one of your patients?
Yeah, I think the first thing to consider with someone that hasn't been training for a while is why they haven't been training, right? There's going to be different reasons that people are away from the gym. Like if it's an athlete, maybe they're taking some time off after a season before getting into off-season training. If it's someone that I'm working with in like a client capacity, it might be someone that's taking time off due to an injury. It could be someone that went on a vacation and then they got lazy and they came back and now they're starting to ease back into things. So the first thing that I'm going to look at is what's the exact reason that this person's been out of the gym and the duration that they're out of the gym. That's going to give you some sort of clue into where they're going to be or the level that they're going to be at as they get back into exercising, and an indication towards what's going to be the appropriate way to ramp back into exercise. And I think another part of that too is that also understanding what they were doing in that period when they were off from training. Were they laid up in a bed because they broke their leg or something? Or is it something that they went on vacation to Hawaii and they were hiking and they were swimming and they were being very active? So there's there's not only a range of reasons that people will be out of the gym, but there's also a range of activity levels that they'll have while they're out of the gym, and then taking that into account is going to give you some sort of projection of where they're going to be when they get back in to working out. And I guess we have to also mention is where they were when they left off before they left the gym, right? Is getting an accurate portrayal of the landscape of their training, what it looked like, the capacity that they had, like what style of training were they doing? Is it strength training? Is it more endurance? Is it sport specific? Like, is it a sports season? Are they coming off the football field? Did they just come off a baseball season, hockey season? So, having an understanding of where they left off, how long they've been off for, and then with that also the activity levels and I guess recovery levels. Like if they were in Hawaii and they did some hiking, but they were mostly just drinking the whole time and like not sleeping, then that's a little bit different than if you were doing 16-mile hikes and like spending an hour scuba diving a day or something. So I think just getting a really accurate picture of what led them to that point where now they've been off and they're at the entry point back into exercise again, and kind of where they left off and everything that led them to this place where, all right, now we need to decide the level that you're at and the appropriate way to get you back into training. And that's really the first kind of level of understanding that I'd have around this.
Have you yourself, like I was just making the assumption because I've known you for a third of your life? Yeah, I've probably known you for about a third of your life.
Yeah.
You probably didn't train for the first third of your life. So I've known you for half of your training life.
Yeah.
Have you ever experienced a considerable window of time off?
Um, Probably relative to most people, no. But I'd say since I've been training, there's been periods that I have been forced to take time off. One was um, tail end of high school. I broke my right ulna wrestling, and that I did actually train through most of it. But I think in that we can look at that specifically for like upper body training, the time off and like how I acclimated back into that. Um, I've had two pretty good back injuries that put me out for a period of time. One was an SI sprain in high school. Again, with that one, I was too young and dumb and don't really remember enough to get pull any experience from that. But about 2 years ago, I herniated at least one disc in my low back, pretty bad, my lumbar region. Was getting like referred pain and couldn't really actually load for a few weeks. So I think those would be the two most relevant in terms of like vacations and trips and stuff. I don't think I've ever taken more than a week off of training, like electively in my life.
I think
Yeah.
there's some interesting takeaways from both of those. Like, and when I say both of those, I mean when you broke your ulna and you're like, I didn't really stop training. I think that's actually a key takeaway when we look at the body of evidence and anecdotally the best way to mitigate detraining effects is to understand what detraining means. And the second thing that you said that I found interesting is, what was the second thing you said? Right towards the end, you were like, uh,
Electing to
the
take off training.
electing to take off. It'll come to me. So let's start with maintaining training. I think that's probably like the prevention is the cure type approach, because now this might speak more to the fitness professional, but if you're a fitness enthusiast and you're looking to navigate your way in and out of training, I think I love how you started with the why. Like, well, why are you taking time off? Is it something that is habitual? Is it something deeper to some of the physiology, into the psychology, that this could be an ongoing issue that we need to solve for X first before we go into like the tactics about how to navigate those waters first? It's like, well, why do we keep ending up in those waters?
Hmm.
The the thing that I think is most useful to understand when we talk about detraining is detraining happens across different adaptations differently, right? So there's 4 buckets that I want to discuss when it comes to detraining. And there's 3 special populations I want to discuss. Look at the structure in the episode.
Yeah, you're
4
killing it.
buckets. We got this. This is a verbal essay on detraining. So the four buckets that we're going to discuss that I think are useful, they're going to be VO2 max, which is like VO2 max is like Hansel right now. So hot. Everyone's up about VO2 max. What I don't get, VO2 max is right now, I think, widely considered in research the number one metric tied to all cause mortality.
Interesting.
That's why I think it's getting so much play. What I don't understand is, why do people want to live forever? Like, I've been
Yeah.
4 times before we hit record. I'm like, I'm out the game, dog. I'm out. I hope my VO2 max is 0 by the end of the day, and I'm just dead. So VO2 max is the first one. Aerobic capacity endurance is the second one. And then hypertrophy is the third. Muscle hypertrophy is the third. And then strength is the fourth. So those are like our 4 major buckets. And I think one of the problems I see with people, and this can be as concentrated as something like a deload, like someone who's deloading for a competition, someone who's maybe deloading in some sort of bodybuilding context of having accumulated hard training weeks, and that deload could stretch from being a deliberate 7-day, 10-day period of a decrease in some stimulus, and we could stretch that deload out to multiple years of no training.
Mm-hmm.
So taking into consideration, sort of the how and the how did we get here and the factors that put us in this position, creating a timeline, almost like, you ever see that show, like 100 Days After Humans or whatever? Like, if humans were wiped off the face of the earth, what? No?
No,
Oh,
but that
man.
sounds like a sick plot. Like,
Dude.
that's the Earth I want to live on.
Like some I Am Legend shit. Just give me an
Yeah.
AK-47 and a German Shepherd. Yeah. So basically, like, the idea is, like, what would Central Park look like 100 days after, 1,000 days after, 10,000 days after, like, human beings were eradicated from the earth or whatever. So I want to set up a timeline of roughly about 6 weeks. So if we look at these 4 buckets, VO2 max, endurance, hypertrophy, and strength, we can plot across basically a 6-week window, and each one of these is going to have a different mile marker on this plot, right? So on these 6 weeks, we're going to see different attributes depreciate at different rates, right? So detraining is relative to the type of stimulus that you're actually training for, right? So it's not a blanket term, which I think is a big thing to understand. So let's start with the first 2 weeks. So the first 2 weeks of detraining, what you're going to experience is an acute drop in VO2 max. So when we get into special populations, the 2 that I think are most pertinent to the VO2 max conversation are going to be elite athletes and the elderly population. So elderly population, they tend to have higher exposures to VO2 max style training. That's a pretty ambiguous term. We can define that later. And you'll see a range, and there's research that suggests this, you'll see a range in depreciation of VO2 max in the first 2 weeks from 7% as high as 25%. So you could, if in 2 weeks of ceasing your activity, lose your VO2 max capacity anywhere between 7% to 25%. And we'll discuss how that range gets broken up. How would you anticipate more if you're going to be on the 25% versus the 7% end of that range? So the takeaway here is detraining VO2 max happens very acutely, right? So it's the first thing to go. It's the first training adaptation that we can really measure that starts to depreciate. So if you take, that 1-2 week vacation, or you go on a month-long honeymoon, you're going to anticipate that VO2 max is the first out the door. Now, the tricky part with this is a lot of times people just they paint this logic of easy come, easy go. The hard part about VO2 max is it's easy go, it's easy to lose, it's the quickest out the door, it needs the least amount of recurring training stimulus to be taken out of a program for it to not completely go to zero, but to start to really lose steam. And it's actually the hardest to get back, which is like kind of a pain in the ass, right? So if you're a more like aerobic based athlete and you're looking for that, high VO2 max, or if you're someone in the elderly population who you're trying to really keep up this side of your health and fitness, you might want to really prioritize that, right? Because you mentioned something that I think was really applicable when you talk about the Hawaii vacation, right? What does a Hawaii vacation look like when you take time off? Because if you're doing these activities like hiking and diving for hours on end, this might be sufficient enough to maintain that. And we'll talk about maintaining, each relative stimulus and what type of training volume and intensity that takes a little bit later. But I think that's a really good place to revert back to. It's like, what does it take for you to maintain it? Because with VO2 max, and it's not like other stimulus as we'll talk about, it's the first one to go and the hardest to get back. And if you're in the athletic end of the spectrum, these are the guys and girls that are going to lose up to 25%. And because they have so much more to lose, right? Like, did you ever test your VO2 max? Like when you were in your CrossFit days?
No, we did like a half-ass kind of test when I was in college in one of my like physiology labs, but I don't. It was so long ago, I don't even remember.
Now, just based off of feel, like your how much how much more aerobically, and now's an interesting time because this is the heaviest you've ever been. How
Oh,
much more aerobically capable were you in your CrossFit days as compared to now?
infinitely, infinitely
Infinitely.
more.
Do you feel that though? Like you feel that difference?
Yeah, the way it manifests for me now is like my heart rate in between working sets, whether it's like strength or like hypertrophy stuff, like something where I'm going close to either like muscular or technical failure, how much that skyrockets my heart rate and then how long it takes to come back down. That's really where I can tell. And I know it's not VO2 max in that specific case, but like shit, a set of like 15 and 8 rest pause bilaterally loaded split squats. That's as close to VO2 max as I'm getting right now.
That's funny. So now, kind of VO2 max athletes biggest. So to bring in your example, you at the height of your CrossFit career, that VO2 max took a lot to attain, and it's likely now more difficult to get it back to where it was than any other training stimulus that you adapted to during CrossFit, right? So if you look at your strength, you're stronger now than you were competing in CrossFit,
Yeah.
right? You're bigger now than when you were competing. So hypertrophy, all of that, you could likely even get your endurance back to a similar level, but your peak, your VO2 max would be really, really difficult. So VO2 max, why I think it's being held in such high regard and being kind of constantly dissected in fitness podcasts and health and longevity podcasts is because it's difficult to attain and it's very fragile in the sense that it's not going to stay with you unless you really stimulate it. So if you, for example, have a client or you yourself are going on a prolonged vacation or something like that, and you only have limited time, and you're someone who's like multimodal with the way that they train and they're kind of after this hybrid sort of athlete, like I won't train anything that looks like VO2 max because I don't care, right? Like it's not something I'm going to, my detraining window of what I'm looking at is like where does atrophy start to occur? Where does strength gain start to where does strength deficit start to occur? That's going to be my viewfinder of detraining. But if you're someone who's going and you like to do a little bit of cardio and a little bit of strength and train for a little bit of size, understanding that alone, being like, hey, look, I got 3 days a week I can train. It's going to be a hotel gym. I'm gone for 4 weeks. Knowing that goes, okay, prioritize your VO2 max work every time you're in the gym, right? Prioritize some sort of submaximal cardiovascular stuff to keep that high because that'll be the thing that's hardest to get back. So that's your first thing out the door is VO2 max. Now, some of you who might be more like muscle bound might not care, but if you're going to have clients, especially if you're training the elderly population or if you have parents that you care about, this could be something that, my parents are going on a cruise They're taking a cruise, and this dude, I fucking, they say you become your parents. If I become the version of my parents that can sit on a cruise ship for 31 days,
Are you kidding me?
31 days.
Oh,
You know how
dude.
quickly that would turn into Captain Phillips? It would just be me, like, I'm the captain now. They're sailing from Australia to North America.
Oh, dude. I, no,
Imagine
I'm not a
that
cruise
level of
person in
bored.
general. That sounds terrible.
Dude, being on a floating sky straight or being in a floating strip mall with a bunch of other cruise people, I think that's
No.
what, if it's not hell, it's definitely purgatory.
31 days? Send them with some vitamin C so they don't get scurvy.
Seriously, yeah, that's what I'm like.
Mm.
What's the ship called? The Santa Maria? Like, what's like what
The
the
New
fuck?
World? Yeah.
Right? You're just gonna get there and start calling everyone Indians? Like, what's like? What's the move there, Ma? But like, okay, cool, 31 days. Now, my dad is a pretty avid cyclist. He's a pretty avid drinker as well, but he's a pretty avid cyclist.
All right.
Post workout carbs usually come by the way of fermented hops for Mike, but like when I'm thinking about that, I'm like, okay, you're going to be, the better part of 4 weeks on a cruise. Like, you're not going to have a velodrome and a bike to go cycling around, but there's a gym there, and I want you to prioritize that. So, we can look at this research and be like, oh, VO2 max, it's like depreciates quickly and it doesn't get back to its ceiling as high as quickly. Okay, great. How do we apply that in the real world? My dad's going to train twice a week. The only thing he's going to do is probably go ride the bike or an elliptical. That's all I care about. And we'll see why as we move through the rest of this continuum. So once we move outside of 2 weeks, two things are starting to happen inside of the 4 week mark. And that's going to be a decrease in aerobic capacity. So now this is like more so your endurance. So your endurance starts to tank, and then your muscle starts to atrophy. You're going to start to get a decrease in the anabolic hormones. You're going to start to get an increase in the catabolic hormones, and you're going to start to lose muscle cross-sectional area, decrease endurance by around week 4, right? So 3 to 4, you're going to start to see those two things. Now, again, like how, if you're gone for 2 weeks, don't really have to worry about muscle loss, like true muscle loss. You might feel flat, or you might feel like you don't have a pump, or you might feel, a bit sluggish. And a lot of those things can be sorted out with nutrition. But from weeks 2 to 4, if you're going to be away from training or think if training is going to be difficult, what if you're going to be away for that long? That's are the next stimuli up on the chopping block. Is going to be your endurance and your muscle hypertrophy. So factor accordingly, right? And then the big ones start to change, and this is where things I think get interesting. And this is probably where it enters more into the way you and I train right now is strength. Strength is going to be neural adaptations, and these neural adaptations of strength loss are going to happen closer to the 6 week mark, right? So this is why, right? Like if you think of prepping for a meet, by the time I finish my last meet, I would take my last heavy squat about 21 days out, which is like a fairly long time.
Yeah.
Now, when I was earlier in my career and I was not as strong, less strong, when I was weaker, that's probably the best way. When I was weaker earlier in my career, that would be something like 11 days or 10 days, right?
Mhm.
So, and I don't really have to worry about it. That window can be much further again. And I know it to be that for guys who are stronger and girls that are stronger, right? Like as you start to bump up in total absolute load, you have this 6 week buffer where your strength will kind of maintain. And it always surprises people, right? Like my friend Marcus, friend of the show, Marcus Leone, he'll go on these like ridiculous vacations and eat fucking pastries in the foothills of Italy for like 3 weeks. And he'll come back and he'll deadlift like 804 for a triple. And I'm like, and he's like, wow, I can't believe that. I'm like, well, I kind of can,
Right.
because what you've done in the last 3 weeks is, you sure your VO2 max, whatever it was, is probably tanked. Your endurance is probably tanked. 3 weeks is not really long enough to start losing too much muscle mass, not so much that the muscle mass you lose. And this is a key point. When you go through atrophy, muscle atrophy is part of the strength loss. When you lose cross-sectional area of a muscle, that loss in muscle cross-sectional area is in part what starts to decrease your strength gains or your expression of your strength gains. So he'll do a 3 week vacation in Italy, come back and smoke an 804 triple on a deadlift, because what's happened is Sure, what VO2 max he had is gone, but it wasn't much to phone home. Sorry, Marcus. And then endurance hypertrophy, maybe a little bit, but there's been a systemic recovery from the prolonged stress. And this kind of ties into where you started off with of like, well, what is your starting point, right? Like what are your abilities going in? So something like that could be, I think the term would almost be seen like super physiological compensation, which what I think happens large in part to that principle. For those of you unfamiliar, super physiological compensation is when you deliberately dig yourself into a hole as far as training fatigue and cumulative training fatigue, and then you take a very acute period off of training. Like, Paul Equin had a protocol of like 12 days in a row, 2 a days, and then take like a week or two off. So you accumulate so much of this neural drive, this neural fatigue, this neural stimulus, and you hopefully get out of there with no structural aberrations, right? You don't break down any soft tissue or anything like that. And then what you have is this tremendous amount of stress on the nervous system with a manageable amount of stress on the musculoskeletal system, the more structural side. And the time off really helps reinforce the repair cycles of some of those more structural tissues, and then really allows you to express then the compensations and the adaptations you've made on the physical side or on the neurological side. So that's when we look at detraining across those three things, or four things rather. I think people need to realize, because someone might take 2 weeks off from strength training and be like, oh man, I got to ease back into it. I'm like, I don't think you do. The research says you probably don't, especially if you're someone who's well established. And one of the things that I see that happens, and this is like a kind of like a coaching moment, if you will, or this is where the application comes in. This is where the experience comes in. Is I'll see people take 2 weeks off training, ease back into training, have a really light training cycle, fall outside of that 6 week window of really pushing that stimulus. And then all of a sudden they get back up to their heavier weights and they get hurt. And it's like, well, yeah, dude, because you didn't have to do that, right? Like your strength was still there. You nerfed yourself mentally after 2 weeks. You went on some 4 week hypertrophy thing because you were worried about getting back under heavy weights. It's like your strength was fine. If anything, you would probably pull a Marcus, not like 800 for a triple, but like, because Marcus is a freak. But, you'd probably actually be in a prime position to pick right up where you left off. And people sell themselves on this idea of detraining, and they go, oh, wait, like I got to not, because I took 2 weeks off, I should ease into it. They do a 4 week block. They push outside that 6 week window. They try to get back to their numbers. It's been 6+ weeks since they've had that intense of a stimulus. And that's where you start to get into like the real danger zones.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to organize it as well, because the way that you laid that out, it's almost a rehab protocol in my mind. If you just look at it as the way that we're going to lose these things, like O2 max, endurance, hypertrophy, and strength. If you look at it in that way, that those are the things that are lost, and that's the order in which it's going to take in terms of duration, to reestablish these things. Say, take that scenario where I broke my arm. I actually have a client that had the same injury that's about 6 weeks out from breaking his radius. But the way that we're going to have to reestablish that baseline is exactly that. And maybe in musculoskeletal injuries, O2 max isn't as relevant, but I look at this as like a periodization model. Exactly, because if we go from lower stimulus or lower ability to produce force, longer duration, that's O2 max, and that's a little bit higher force. Less duration is like the endurance in this scenario, and then hypertrophy would be kind of like our glycolytic energy system, and then strength and power would be more on the side of phosphogenic, right? So we're kind of retracing those steps in terms of rehabbing an injury. Is that before we can really start to build strength, we need to have the muscle there. Before we can really start to load muscle, we need to have the energy or the endurance available to be able to hold positions. So that's, inadvertently the exact same way that I look at the rehab process. Is we need to establish some baseline of endurance for longer periods of time against lower stress before we can start to build muscle, before we can start to build strength. And reversing that, looking at it that way, what are the things we're going to hold on to for the longest amounts of time? They're the things that come from more stressful adaptations, more loadable adaptations. So, like, yes, we can get stress in VO2 max, in endurance through longer durations, but the overall intensity is still going to be relatively low. It's just a low intensity for a long period of time, as opposed to hypertrophy is a moderate intensity for less time, and then strength would be a high intensity for the least amount of time. So understanding it in that way is that the things that we worked the hardest to gain, or require the highest level of adaptation to gain, they're going to be the things that we retain the best. So someone that broke their arm, yeah, maybe this kid's 6 weeks out from an injury, but he hasn't really begun to lose too much strength yet. What he's lost is everything up until strength. Like, he's getting to that point where the endurance is garbage because he's been in a cast or a sling for 6 weeks. Maybe we're starting to get some muscular atrophy. But the overall adaptation of strength, like, yes, he's very well rested, very well recovered, and could probably express that, but it's not appropriate to do that yet because we don't have the qualities or the capabilities that are prerequisites to loading in that way, or to eliciting stress through intensity yet. So we kind of have to rewalk through each of these adaptations. We have to build better endurance to the area. We have to build back a little bit muscle before it's going to be fully appropriate to get to a more maximal loading and start to elicit stimulus in that way.
Yeah, you bring up something super interesting on the intensity end, and that's where I think that's when it comes to the research. There's that word again. Everyone loves the research. Maybe J Marsh will clip that, put the research in there. Yeah. And this is where, like, research is necessary, but critical thinking is imperative. Like, you have to be able to think critically. The term that they use in research, and I'm going to give the devil its due. It makes sense, but in the way I see it interpreted, it oftentimes is ill applied. So the best prevention to detraining, the best cure for detraining is prevention. Now, this is where I find stuff gets really interesting, is the ability to maintain some of these harder to yield adaptations and what it actually takes to maintain them. So the principle in research that we often see cited is reduced volume training. So reduced volume training is like, well, most people would say this is like maintenance. How do I maintain? I have a particular VO2 max or endurance or hypertrophy or strength. What's the minimum that I need to do to maintain this? And this is where there's so many layers of nuance if you're willing and open to explore them, that this conversation really permeates into a lot of mainstream conversations that are being had around more so hypertrophy, but around volume prescriptions on the whole, right? So this is where this idea of maximum recoverable volume is like, how much can you do while you still recover, is something that I struggle with as a concept to impart for this very reason. So what I mean by that is, when we look to maintain these adaptations, whether it be more on the cardiovascular side, VO2 max and endurance, and on the muscle and strength side, hypertrophy and maximal strength, let's kind of put those into two buckets, right? So we have, like, let's call it the more cardio ones and the more weight training ones. They're not mutually exclusive, but bear with me. If we want to maintain our strength and hypertrophy, we can drop our training volume down to 1/3 and maintain. Now, there's a key to this, and there's a key to all reduced volume training principles, because cardiovascular will have its own ratio. But for strength and hypertrophy, you can maintain, the research proves this, or supports this. Research proves you know how to read. The research supports this hypothesis that you can reduce your training volume down to 1/3. Which means if you do 3 sessions a week, you do 1 session a week. The key being the intensity still has to be high. Right? You need to have high intensity. It's not reduced volume and reduced intensity. It's just reduced volume. So whatever that 1 session is, has to be pretty fucking balls out, right? Like, it has to keep that intensity high. And that's like a problem number one. Where I think this conversation is really interesting is that this is a ratio. this is a relative ratio of volume. So in order to maintain the hypertrophy and strength that I've accumulated, I need to do 1/3 of the amount of overall work that I do in a week to maintain it. But if my training program has it so that I'm always aiming at maximum recoverable volume to push this stimulus uphill, all I've done is hamstrung my ability in times that I have to be away from training for a prolonged period of time, is I've dragged the bottom end of that ratio up, right? So if I'm doing, 100 sets of a body part, I'm being hyperbolic on purpose here, but if I'm doing, like, I want to do as much volume as I can, and maximum recoverable volume is really the goal, it's like, well, hold on a second. In a vacuum, maybe, but if you're dealing with someone in real life who wants to maintain their strength gains and has a fluctuating schedule, if I need to put someone into maintenance, it's way easier to maintain what gains with a Z that they've made by having a lower volume by which those gains came about than by really trying to send it into the fucking stratosphere with as much volume as possible. And then when I go to a 1/3 of that, I actually have a maintenance training volume that might be unsustainable in some cases where I really need a low bar. So that's where I think the detraining conversation, like, you know, it's always hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. And I think when you understand, like, a lot of times a training program, at least in the coaching space, it's one thing if you're like us and your whole life revolves around training, and you set it up to be that way, and your job supports it, and you have some freedom of time and space. Like, if anyone could go down the, I'm going to do as much volume as possible because I'll never detrain because I'll always be training in some capacity, it's probably you and I. But, like, I caution those people who work with other people for a living, and those people's lives aren't centered around resistance training, and they have variables like, kids and travel and work and significant others and all that. Like, you might not want to aim for something that's so not sustainable at scale. So that's like a very, I think, to be a pertinent application to understanding detraining research, especially in the musculoskeletal. It's 1/3, but it's a relative to the amount of volume you're currently doing at a high intensity. So it's like, I want to push that rock up the hill. And look, I love to train. I train a lot. But if I'm training a client, some executive travels all over the world who doesn't have a life that's focused around training, when things are good, like things are stable, I'm aiming for the amount of training volume that's going to be maintainable at 1/3 that volume for when things go bad. That's going to be the key that drives consistency long term, is because what progress we make in those windows is easily maintainable, and we can keep chipping up the hill of these adaptations. So it's a thing that I think a lot of coaches miss. They sort of just succumb to this and this is the difference between optimization and adaptation. It's like, this is a very adaptable program that I'm writing for someone who is going to know that they're going to enter into these periods of relative detraining. And if I know that 1/3 is the number or the ratio, I want the one of that 3 in the ratio to be to the power of a 3 of a baseline training volume that's not as high as fucking possible. So that I know when they fall into these windows of decreased training volume, that even what is decreased is still manageable.
Yeah, I think that's a good principle just to think about when considering overall program design, because it's just not sustainable to think about max recoverable volume for most people most of the time, right? It's doing, and there may be periods for people that are more competitive or have more training specific goals to go through periods of that. But still, even when you're doing that, you're accelerating progress really quickly. And that's not sustainable in the long term. That might be a short term strategy. And it's essentially the way I look at linear periodization is that linear periodization works, and it works well, but it doesn't work for that long, right? You're going to be able to ramp up and you're going to be able to see progress. But every time that you do that, it's going to become less and less effective. So it's not a good long-term strategy. And it could be something that you use in the short term, higher volume periods that aren't as sustainable if you need to see progress by a specific date. But for most people, most of the time, that's not going to be the case. And the approach that I take towards most people most of the time is going to be, what's the minimal effective dose, right? How little can we do to still push the envelope in the right direction? What can we do, and what are the smallest changes, the micro progressions that we can make along the way to keep this effective with doing the least amount? And that's not in the interest of just having being lazy or like doing less or anything like that, or like trying to hack anything. That's in the interest of having someone progress for as long as physically possible. Because once, and you mentioned as well, one of the things that we have to consider with that is that I'm, for the most part, talking like variation and volume with this when I'm talking minimal effective dose. Because I still want them to be pushing intensity on all of these things. But I want it to be less variables that they have to think about, less variables that we have to control while doing this. Because volume is going to lead towards, it's I mean, there's the Eric Bagera quote of that volume works in absence of accuracy, right? In an inaccurate program, something where we're taking a shotgun approach, like, yeah, volume will get you there, but it's not a sustainable approach. It's short term, and it's going to be less specific towards any one adaptation or any one thing. So if we want to be accurate in the way that we're creating changes and we want it to be sustainable, then have less variables, period. So less volume, less exercises. Choose exactly what you need to. And that, for me, in like my training or a lot of the people I work with, that's maybe 4 or 5 exercises that I'm looking to push hard on per session. And within that, it's minuscule progressions. We're looking like maybe 5 pounds here, 5 pounds there, maybe 1 rep or 2 reps here, or maybe it's just like completing this a set with the same exact variables at a lower RPE. Like, these are all progressions, and these are all things that can be meaningful if you're looking in the right places. But it's something that's sustainable, and it's something that, especially when you're talking about 1/3 of the volume, we can cut that by 2/3, and that can still be a really effective training session. Like, say you have 4 exercises, 3 working sets, RPE 8 across the board. You're traveling in the gym, you can go in, do a leg press, a split squat, a quad extension, a hamstring curl, and you can push one hard set on each of those, be out of the gym in 45 minutes, maybe an hour, and be on with your day. Like, that's a very sustainable and very practical way to look at program design.
Yeah, and that's where I think all program design should start from, is the sustainability piece, right? And
Mhm.
that's why I think, and why I love the way you started off this, like, okay, if I'm to look at how to manage detraining or coming off of detraining windows, it's the habitual side. It's like, why was training not sustainable out of the gate? And sometimes, and oftentimes, I see this when I talk to people, I consult with people. It's the training that they were doing was unsustainable, and it's actually led to full cessation, right? Like,
Yeah.
you are not your client is probably one of the most important principles that I learned early in my career, because I used to train on, it's shoulder day today, Mrs. Johnson. Like, why is it shoulder day for Mrs. Johnson? That makes no sense. And it's, you learn it through like the, I don't train full body, but I should probably train my clients full body. Got it. To like, oh, I actually probably shouldn't, prescribe as much as this person could do every single session, because it's more important for her to show up. Like, early in my career, my hallmark was fucking crippling people the first workout.
Oh
I
yeah.
would be sick to my stomach
You're
if
not a
I
good trainer
wrote,
if you don't do that.
right. And now I know on the other side of that I would be a dog shit trainer, because the number of people, like, I used to sit there like a czar, and like Ivan Drago, like, if he dies, he dies. And it was like, if the number of people I would do consults for that would never come back, that probably haven't walked since I did a workout with them, not even like haven't even worked out, that have
No, no,
been a
paraplegic.
paraplegic
Yeah.
since, right? And it's just like, man, what a stupid thing to do, right? Like, at the psychological level, and obviously at the long-term detriment to the physiological level, and then cycling back to the psychological level. Like, it's just not what we're after. So I think one of the things, I look at detraining like the way I look at contracts. I still remember the day you and I put together an operating agreement with former business partners. And like, if you're not used to language in, in contracts, it's very abrupt. It's very to the point, and it's very much there to protect everyone. And you learn this over time. It's very much there to protect everyone when things go bad.
Mhm.
It's sort of this Murphy's law of like whatever can happen probably will happen. So let's try
Yeah.
and think of every scenario. And thank God we did that. Right.
Right.
Because like you don't get into business with people. And I guess a prenuptial agreement would be a similar type of contract. Operating agreements are things that I'm slightly more experienced with, slightly more experienced with.
Uh,
But it's like it becomes easier over time. And I think when you're getting into a client trainer relationship, you want to set out the parameters for worst case scenario. And what you're writing in part when you're writing a program is you're writing a contract. We are going to follow through on this.
mhm.
But too many trainers take the straight line to all things are good. We've talked about our goals and, we're going to crush it. There's a lot of like high fiving. It's like, yeah, then life happens. And then
Yeah.
life happens, and then people start peopling, and you're just like, oh fuck, like man, that was a cool consult, but now they're up 5 pounds, and they're not happy, and they're not sleeping. Their significant other wants them to stop. It's like, okay, write the contract from that place, right? Don't write it from the dap up, high five, excited to get back, man. This is gonna be sick. Like I heard you're the fucking man. It's like stop with all the nonsense. Stop with all of the, let's bring this down to you. Where do you like to go when your life gets bad? Right? This is a conversation I have with athletes all the time because you know what? They know. They know exactly where. They know the hooker's name. They know the fucking hotel they go to. They know the drug dealer they call. They know, like, but it's like, hey, okay, cool. Let's start from the thing that if worst case happens, we're still making progress. Then if worst case doesn't happen, we're making better progress. Like it's human nature to default to this optimistic positivity. And it's not being cynical, it's not being pessimistic, it's being experienced. That like if you like, hey man, what when the week gets hard, what is it? Is it Little Debbie? Is it Jack Daniels? Like who are you reaching for that's going to get in the way of progress? Is it hookers? Is it blow? Like what's your and if you write a program from there, we can always titrate up, but it's really hard to catch yourself to try and bring that down to the level of like worst case scenario. And I don't think people look at training programs like contracts. But the more I started to run into these worst case scenarios that I probably could have equated for if I paid just a little bit of attention to what mattered, it was like, oh, that's really what this is. And if I can prepare for and have contingencies in place, then it becomes easy. What does the contract say?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm going to be on the road. Okay. Well, the program says we'll cut down to 1/3 volume. This is what we've been doing. Great. Oh, you want to keep up cardiovascular endurance stuff? That's 2/3 volume. I'm glad we haven't been running you 10 days a week for the last year and a half because that would be unsustainable on the road, right? We've been doing this amount of volume, which allows this cool window to cut out a session or cut out 2 sessions, and that'd be really sustainable. So it's something that I don't understand why isn't further. I mean, I do understand. I understand the psychology of why detraining isn't discussed, but when you actually start to do this for a living at a high level and successfully, you realize that understanding the principles of detraining actually act as your guidelines for writing effective programs.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And a kind of obvious principle you can draw from that too is that the understanding that it's going to be much harder to build peak level performance than it will be to maintain that. And you'll see this a lot of times. Like, I think strength sports are a really good example. Is you'll see people that work their ass off through a portion of their career just to obtain specific goals, and then you'll see them kind of plateau out because something in life changes, like they get a new job or they have more responsibilities, they have a kid or something, and they could still perform at a really high level, but they can't push the envelope any further than they already have. And it's kind of the manifestation of that principle that you're saying, is that if you can do, like, there was a time in my life I was weightlifting 9 sessions a week. 9 sessions a week. And I saw really great progress. My total shot up, my lift shot up. I was very strong. But I got to a point where that was no longer sustainable. And I didn't necessarily see a drop off in performance, but I was able to maintain a relatively high level, relatively the same numbers, but it was so much harder for me at a lower training volume to push past that because I had pushed up that volume ceiling so high. and I've done that through frequency. But it's once you get to that high level of performance, you can look at this as a positive or a negative, or just look at it realistically. But it's once you get to that point, it's going to be hardest to achieve that high level of performance, but you can still maintain that level of performance with a lot less effort. And that can be a very encouraging thing for people that maybe don't have high performance goals. And this is something I look at with people I've trained, Gen Pop, or people that I work with in terms of rehabs. I talk about a pain threshold. If you have, a specific level of detraining, which you have now crossed that pain threshold, that your symptoms are now prevalent, and you're starting to see the manifestation of whatever it is, lack of endurance, lack of hypertrophy, lack of strength, that's causing these symptoms to rear their head, then that's something that we can be mindful of, and we can understand that, okay, we just need to get you to a point. We need to work hard to get you to a point where you're above that pain threshold. And now once you're above that, it's going to be a lot easier to maintain that level of physical competency, or whatever adaptation it is that's gotten you across that pain threshold, gotten you above that, than it was to actually get you out of pain. So the hardest part of this process is actually creating the change. But once we create an acceptable level of change, it becomes so much easier to maintain that. And I think that can be a really encouraging thing for people, especially that are in pain, is that they're motivated at that time to create change, because pain is a great motivator. They don't want to feel pain anymore. And once you can get them to buy in, and you see it doesn't necessarily have to be them out of that pain threshold, but once they can have periods of relief, like if you have someone that's in chronic pain and you could get them to have periods of time where there's no pain at all, even if that pain comes back, that's huge for them. And then that's even more buy-in along the process, is that, okay, we did X, Y, and Z, and that got you above pain threshold for this long. We're headed in the right direction. Let's push a little bit harder and see how long we can extend that window where you are above that pain threshold. And then once we get you to a place where you're no longer feeling that pain threshold, or maybe more realistically, you're only feeling it in periods of detraining or high levels of fatigue, then it's really easy to maintain that progress once we get you there. But the hardest part is getting you there.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the programming conversation starts with this phrase reverse engineering, which is true, but you have to understand what exactly you're reverse engineering from. I think if you reverse engineer from detraining, you're probably going to end up, at least from like a volume prescription standpoint, in a way better place in the way you write programs. So I think it's massively understated, widely overlooked, but hopefully you guys got something out of this. You know, in the interest of time, I don't want to belabor it too much. It's something I think we could revisit in the future. If you guys like the podcast, can we? I'm not. You know what it is? I come in ebbs and flows of trashing boomers in the podcast space. I'm going to try and play it nice. If you guys enjoy the podcast, share it with your friends, Spotify, iTunes, on YouTube as well, RX Radio. So we'll wrap there for today. We'll be doing more topical deep dives heading into Wednesday episodes in the future. So do let us know if there's anything you want to see. YouTube comment section is a pretty cool place to interact. So if you guys want to find us there, feel free to subscribe, and then describe the topics you want us to discuss at length. We have a bunch on deck for you, so don't worry. We're not going to be sitting there relying on you guys for podcast episodes. We have a ton to talk about, and we'll discuss more next week, guys. Appreciate you hanging out. We'll see you then.